I watched in horror as my cherished Victorian mansion was reduced to smouldering ruins, while my HOA neighbor, Karen, leisurely sipped her coffee, convinced she'd finally conquered our long-standing feud. She had no inkling that I'm a federal judge with the authority to obliterate everything she's built. How far will she push me before I let my true identity be known? Drop a comment below and share where you're watching from. The day began as usual. Me, perched on my grandmother's century-old porch swing with a steaming cup of coffee, as the sunrise painted the heavens in soft pink hues above the distinctive purple trim of our Victorian home. That's when I noticed her, Karen Thompson Power, striding purposefully toward my mailbox, clutching an envelope as if it were pure gold. I'd seen that determined glint in her eye before, at the neighborhood meetings she'd been hosting at her newly renovated McMansion next door. My stomach knotted as she deposited the envelope in my box and lingered long enough to snap photos of my front yard with her phone. My grandmother's roses were in full, unruly bloom, a wild contrast to Karen's meticulously pruned boxwood hedges. I knew well that she despised every stray petal. The envelope carried what she touted as a thrilling opportunity, a formal invitation to join the newly established HOA, accompanied by a glossy brochure showcasing a row of identical beige houses with uniform mailboxes. The cost of membership was steep, a $5,000 initiation fee plus monthly dues of $350. Yet what made my hands tremble wasn't the money, it was the attached list of mandatory property modifications. It demanded that I eliminate all non-approved paint colors, including my grandmother's beloved purple trim. I was further ordered to replace the heritage rose garden with sanctioned vegetation and remove the antique wind chimes that had lulled me to sleep since childhood. I watched Karen through my window as she moved on to the next house, her phone pressed to her ear. Yes, I had just delivered the final invitation. Now she'd have no choice but to join, the very last holdout on our street. Her voice dripped with saccharine sweetness that set my teeth on edge. Later that evening, invitation in hand, I strolled to Karen's house. The doorbell chimed out a jaunty version of "We Are the Champions." Naturally, she answered, adorned with a neighborhood watch badge and a smile she probably thought was welcoming. "I've reviewed your invitation," I said evenly, my years in law, keeping my tone steady. "I must decline. This home has been in my family for 3 generations, and I intend to preserve its historic character." Her smile evaporated faster than free cookies at a bake sale. "You don't understand," she insisted, leaning forward conspiratorially. "This isn't really an invitation. The HOA is already in effect. Your property is surrounded by members. You have to join." I calmly produced the property maps I'd researched that afternoon. "Actually, that's not true. My deed predates any HOA agreements, and I have no legal obligation to join." 20 years of legal practice had taught me to be thorough. Karen's face flushed a deep red. "Listen here," she snapped, discarding the pretense of politeness. "This neighborhood is changing, progress is happening. If you don't get with the program, things could become very difficult. Houses that don't meet code end up with accidents, citations, and fines that pile up." I met her gaze unflinchingly. "Is that a threat, Mrs. Thompson?" She stepped back slightly, only to return with that fake, saccharine smile. "Of course not. I'm simply concerned about property values and safety. Older homes like yours are prone to electrical and structural issues. It would be a tragedy if something happened because you refused to modernize." Behind her, I caught a glimpse of her husband watching from the window, phone in hand, his posture uneasy. I nodded politely and turned to leave, but Karen's voice called after me. "1 week," she declared. You have 1 week to reconsider before the HOA board meets to discuss enforcement options. As I headed home, I noticed unfamiliar faces watching me from their windows. Karen's loyal HOA allies, no doubt. I sensed this wouldn't end with a simple refusal. That night, I spent hours installing security cameras around my property to document every detail. I'd learned long ago to trust my instincts, and they were screaming that Karen Thompson was only just beginning. What I didn't know then was that this wasn't merely a squabble about property values or a cherished purple trim. In my 3 decades of dealing with difficult people, I'd never encountered anyone quite like Karen. As I drifted off to sleep with the gentle sound of my grandmother's wind chimes in the background, I had no idea that this was merely the prelude to a war that would upend everything, and that my beloved Victorian home would be its first casualty. Karen had made one fatal error by choosing her target. She hadn't yet realized the storm she'd unleashed. The next morning, Karen's shrill voice rang out outside my window. "Look at those hideous purple trims, they're ruining our property values." I peered out to see her leading a band of HOA members on what they called a morning inspection. My heart sank as I watched them document every inch of my grandmother's treasured home. I tried to savor my morning coffee on the porch, but their hushed criticisms drifted across the lawn. "Did you notice those archaic wind chimes? Not HOA approved at all. And those roses, they're 3 inches taller than allowed." Each day brought a new complaint, each one more absurd than the last. They began leaving warning letters, bright orange sheets taped to my door, about violations that hadn't even existed before the HOA took over. My heritage rose garden, planted by my grandmother's own hands, was suddenly a neighborhood eyesore. The once celebrated Victorian purple trim, once a magnet for tourists, became their prime target. One Tuesday morning, I caught Karen measuring my lawn with a ruler. 11.5 inches, she announced triumphantly to her partner Barbara, who scribbled furiously in her notebook. "That's 3.5 inches over code." I stepped outside calmly, coffee in hand, and said, "You're trespassing on private property, asserting my legal rights, while keeping my judicial identity under wraps." Karen merely smirked and continued snapping photos. The harassment took on creative forms. They arranged for landscapers to show up at precisely 7 a.m. on Saturdays, with equipment roaring right by my bedroom window. Anonymous code enforcement complaints became a regular occurrence. Each time, I calmly presented officials with my home's historic status documentation. I watched Karen fume from her window, engaging in what felt like psychological warfare. Soon after, she organized HOA meetings in her driveway, right outside my home office. I overheard them discussing how some properties were dragging down the neighborhood's reputation and needed to be dealt with for everyone's benefit. My security cameras captured their antics as they tested my patience to the limit. They even let their dogs roam my yard, only to act shocked when I showed them the footage. "Oh, my precious Bentley would never," Karen gasped, clutching her pearls as her massive golden doodle left yet another unwelcome present on my lawn. The breaking point came at the annual block party. Naturally, I wasn't invited, but I could still hear Karen loudly outlining plans to revitalize the neighborhood. "Some older homes," she declared, casting a glance at my house, "just don't fit the community's vision anymore." That's when I noticed people taking pictures of my home's foundation and whispering about supposed structural issues. I stayed composed, meticulously documenting every instance, every letter, every photo, every anonymous complaint. I recorded them all. When they installed glaring security lights aimed at my bedroom windows, I added a note about light pollution to my mounting evidence. My grandmother always taught me to be patient, and as Karen's group grew bolder, I knew that timing would be everything. Later that night, while reviewing my security footage, I caught something deeply unsettling. Two HOA board members examining my property line markers and whispering about easement regulations. I recognized that look. They were scheming something far more sinister. But they had no idea that my career had been built on dealing with people who thought they were above the law. I switched off my porch light that evening, watching Karen's crew huddle in her driveway. I wondered how long I should wait before revealing exactly who they were messing with. I never imagined I'd catch Karen and two other HOA board members skulking around my property at midnight. Yet there they were, illuminated by my kitchen light as I got up for a glass of water. My heart nearly stopped when I saw chemical sprayers in their hands, aimed directly at my grandmother's century-old rose garden. "What do you think you're doing?" I yelled from my porch phone, already recording every moment. Karen jumped in surprise, but quickly regained her composure, her phony smile spreading like a contagion. "Oh, we're just eliminating these so-called invasive species," she cooed sweetly, continuing to spray my roses. "The HOA enforces strict rules about non-native plants. If you just join us, we can address these issues properly." I stepped closer, my blood boiling though my tone remained even. "Those aren't invasive species, Karen. They're heritage Victorian roses planted by my grandmother in 1960. I have the original documentation and gardening society registration." The other board members shifted uncomfortably, yet Karen held her ground. "Well, someone complained about the smell," she sniffed, readjusting her designer pajamas, "and these thorns are a safety hazard for children passing by your private property." I raised my voice behind the fence, turning on my security lights. "The property line is clearly marked, and you're trespassing." At that moment, Bob, Karen's husband, stepped from the shadows. A retired police sergeant, he assumed he could intimidate anyone. Now, let's not jump to accusations. We're merely upholding neighborhood standards," he said. I countered, "Nobody wants to live next to a jungle," while noticing Mrs. Watson, my elderly neighbor across the street, peering through her curtains. She had been bullied into joining the HOA just last month after similar late-night visits. Her once beautiful rock garden had been replaced within days by generic Karen-approved shrubs. The next morning, my roses were dead, their vibrant petals turned black and withered. But in doing so, Karen had unwittingly revealed the HOA's pattern of singling out certain homeowners. During my lunch break at the county records office, I discovered that every home that initially resisted joining the HOA later suffered mysterious accidents or code violations until they were forced to sell. That very afternoon, I installed high-definition security cameras, carefully camouflaging them among my remaining plants. Later that evening, I watched as Karen paraded potential buyers past my property. "Of course, this eyesore will be dealt with soon," she announced loudly. "We have ways of handling troublesome residents." The following week, the harassment became relentless. My mailbox was knocked over repeatedly. Anonymous complaints about noise, on days I wasn't even home, piled up. Code enforcement officers showed up daily, found nothing, yet returned again and again. My garbage bins vanished, only to be returned in blatant violation of HOA rules. I documented every incident meticulously, building my case in silence. But Karen's group only grew more brazen. They started staging HOA meetings right in front of my house, pointing out every perceived flaw to potential new residents. "This property is dragging down home values," Karen would declare, brandishing her designer handbag with emphasis. "But don't worry, it won't be a problem much longer." The final straw came when I caught them tampering with my historic fence posts, loosening them while pretending to measure the sidewalk. My security cameras recorded Karen issuing orders to her minions. "Once these posts fail inspection, you'll have to replace the entire fence with our approved model," she explained, hinting it would cost thousands. "Unless, of course, you join the HOA." That night, as I reviewed the footage, I noticed something even more disturbing. The HOA inspection team always included someone taking photos of my electrical boxes, gas lines, and other utilities. They were systematically documenting every potential vulnerability of my home. But why? The pieces of the puzzle were coming together to form a picture that sent chills down my spine. I knew I had to act fast, yet I couldn't reveal my hand too soon. Little did I realize that Karen had already set in motion a plan that would change everything, a plan that would bring all my worst fears roaring to life. My hands shook as I lifted the morning paper, reading a headline announcing that I had just sentenced a corrupt CO to prison. The courtroom had fallen silent when my clerk, Emily, burst in, her face ghostly white. "Your Honor, your house, it's on fire!" Those 5 words made my blood run cold. I abandoned my black robes and raced down the courthouse steps, my heart pounding like a runaway drum. 15 minutes. That was all it took to drive home, though it felt like an eternity. I could see dark plumes of smoke rising from blocks away, and my stomach churned. The exquisite purple trim my grandmother had painstakingly painted was now being devoured by furious orange flames. As I screeched to a halt in front of my burning home, firefighters were already battling the inferno. The heat struck me like a solid wall, and I heard the ancient wooden beams groan under the assault of the fire. Everything my family had built over 3 generations was vanishing before my eyes. Through my tears I caught sight of Karen, standing in her driveway in designer yoga pants, casually sipping her overpriced coffee as if watching a morning show. Her perfectly styled blonde hair glimmered in the sunlight while she chatted with other HOA board members. They made no effort to hide their satisfaction, whispering and pointing at various parts of my engulfed home. Fire Chief Martinez approached me with a grim look. "Ma'am, it appears to be an electrical fire. These old houses have dangerous wiring." But I knew better. Just yesterday I'd had my annual electrical inspection. Everything was up to code, as always. After Karen's recent threats about unsafe historic properties at the town meeting, I had checked my security footage. Then it hit me like lightning. I pulled out my phone, my hands trembling as I tried to access the recordings. The screen was blank. The cameras had mysteriously stopped recording at exactly 3 a.m., 4 hours before the fire began. This was no mere coincidence. As I watched my home burn, memories flooded back. Baking cookies in that old kitchen with Grandma, celebrating my law school graduation in the garden, and my very first day on the bench. Every cherished moment, every piece of my heritage was going up in flames. Everything went up in smoke simply because I refused to cave in to Karen's precious HOA ultimatum. Amid the gathering crowd, I caught sight of 2 all too familiar faces, Bob Johnson and Mike Peters, both on the HOA board, trying to blend in with the growing throng of neighbors. But it was their boots that grabbed my attention. They were the exact work boots I'd seen on my security footage last week when my rose bushes were defaced. Now, they were stained with what seemed to be either fresh mud or perhaps ash. Before I could dwell on it, Karen swaggered over, her face twisted into a mask of feigned concern. "Oh dear, this is just awful. If only you'd joined our HOA. We have such strict safety standards. But you were so headstrong about preserving history," she cooed, drawing out the last word as if it were a curse. Sipping her coffee slowly, she left me seething silently. I bit back my retort until it nearly tasted of blood. Not yet. I couldn't show all my cards. Instead, I watched as she whipped out her phone and started typing furiously. Moments later, I overheard another neighbor buzzing about an unbelievable deal on prime land that had just been listed in some exclusive real estate group. Meanwhile, the fire department had finally tamed the blaze, though the damage was done. The stunning Victorian windows lay shattered, the hand-carved porch railings were charred beyond recognition, and part of the roof had collapsed. A century's worth of legacy reduced to ruin in mere hours. Standing there, watching the smoke curl into the brightening sky. I knew what I had to do. Karen believed she'd triumphed. She thought she'd broken me. Instead, she'd made the gravest error of her life. I pulled out my phone and made 3 calls. One to an old friend at the FBI, another to my contact at the state attorney's office, and a third to a trusted private investigator. I caught Karen's eyes flickering with uncertainty as she watched me. For a split second, she had no clue who I was dialing, but something in my resolute demeanor must have rattled her. Good. Let her worry. While my home smoldered, my true power wasn't in property, it was in justice. As the sun climbed higher, I picked up a small, charred sliver of purple trim. Grandma always said that sometimes losing everything gives you the strength to fight back. Glancing at Karen's smug expression one last time, I realized exactly what my next step needed to be. But first, I had to expose just how deep the HOA's corruption ran. In the ruins of my grandmother's home, I vowed to turn my sorrow into purpose. While Karen strutted around the neighborhood, spreading vicious rumors that I'd set my own house on fire for insurance money, I quietly began pulling the threads that would unravel her entire empire. My breakthrough came when an old law school friend, now a real estate investigator, uncovered a strange pattern. Every house that had mysteriously burned in our county over the last 5 years ended up sold to the same shell company, owned by none other than Karen's sister-in-law. My hands shook as I dug into property records, each page confirming a pattern too perfect to be accidental. I then hired a private investigator to speak with former neighbors who'd lost their homes. Their stories echoed mine exactly. Refused to join the HOA and then endure relentless harassment followed by bizarre accidents or even fires. Most had been forced to sell their homes for a pittance to Karen's investment group. I vividly recall one elderly man breaking down, tearfully describing how a suspicious garage fire had wiped out his family photos the day after he'd declined to join. The smoking gun arrived unexpectedly via Karen's former assistant treasurer, who reached out through my lawyer. Over coffee at a quiet diner 2 towns over, she handed me a USB loaded with 5 years' worth of HOA financial records. Her hands trembled as she detailed how Karen had forced her to falsify the books, threatening to expose her undocumented status if she didn't comply. The records revealed hundreds of thousands in mysterious cash deposits. After every accidental fire, I spent sleepless nights connecting the dots. Karen's husband wasn't just a retired cop. He'd served as the fire investigator too. Every suspicious blaze in the area was swiftly labeled an accident with no further scrutiny, and insurance companies cashed in millions on his reports. My security cameras captured far more than just arsonists at work. They recorded weekly gatherings at Karen's place with real estate developers, all salivating over blueprints for luxury condos to replace our historic homes. One developer even bragged about bribing city officials to tweak zoning laws once enough properties were under their control. I had uncovered Karen's modus operandi. She targeted homes in prime locations, especially those with historic charm that couldn't be easily replicated. First, she'd use HOA regulations to harass homeowners, then escalate to vandalism and intimidation. And if that didn't work, mysterious accidents would soon follow. Her crew would swoop in, rescue the distressed homeowners by buying their properties at rock-bottom prices. Working late one night, I found irrefutable evidence in old county records. Karen had done this before. 3 other historic neighborhoods in nearby counties had suffered the same fate. She'd move in, set up her HOA, drive out those who resisted, and then sell off the consolidated properties to developers for millions. She even had community service awards for neighborhood improvement on her mantle. Though the evidence was damning, I needed more. I persuaded the FBI to wire a meeting with Karen's former treasurer. The recorded conversation was explosive. Karen bragged about upcoming targets, joked about potential electrical issues in certain houses, and even threatened to make the treasurer disappear if she ever spoke out. Every day I watched Karen parade through the neighborhood, meticulously planning her next move, while I quietly built my case. She had no idea that every smug gesture, every counterfeit note of sympathy regarding my tragic loss, was being documented. Her arrogance would be her undoing. The final piece fell into place when I discovered why she'd singled out my house. Hidden in the city archives was an old map detailing a planned highway expansion. Karen's developer friends had insider information. My property was key to their new shopping complex. They'd already acquired the surrounding land via shell companies, but my house was the linchpin. Without it, their multi-million-dollar project would crumble. As I organized the evidence for the FBI, Karen's desperation grew. She filed daily complaints about my unsightly property, now nothing more than a burned-out shell. She even had the nerve to propose a special HOA assessment to clean up my lot, a move that would fill her own pockets. Little did she know, every step she took only bolstered my case. I stood outside the community center, heart pounding, as I watched Karen march through the door, clutching her signature coffee mug and a stack of papers. Tonight's HOA meeting was going to be different. After 6 months of meticulous planning, I was finally ready to show her exactly who she'd been messing with. Peering through a window, I saw her setting up her PowerPoint presentation, no doubt filled with doctored violation photos and bogus rules. My hands trembled as I adjusted my judicial robes, carefully folded in my briefcase. The FBI wire pressed under my blazer, a constant reminder that everything had to be flawless. The property at 247 Maple Saint had officially been declared a public nuisance. Then Karen's voice boomed across the room. In accordance with our emergency powers, we're moving forward with immediate redevelopment plans. A murmur of confused voices swept through the room. The decent neighbors, too frightened to challenge her before, fidgeted in their plastic chairs. "Any objections?" she demanded, with a condescending scan. When silence answered, she sneered. "Well then, let me show you our exciting plans for—" "I object, Mrs. Thompson," I interjected sharply. Every head turned as I walked down the center aisle, my heels clicking against the linoleum. For a fleeting moment, Karen's smug grin faltered, but she quickly masked it. "Oh, so you finally admitted defeat. Your burnt-out hunk of a house is an eyesore," she taunted. "We're doing you a favor, really." She sipped her coffee with that same self-satisfied smirk she'd worn while watching my home burn. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Actually, I'm here to present some evidence of my own." I spread out photographs across the table. "These security camera stills show you and your board members on my property the night of the fire." Interesting timing, wouldn't you agree? Karen's face twitched in response. "They could be anyone," she stammered. "And besides," she began, "you can't prove—" "Oh, but I can," I interrupted, unveiling more documents. "Bank records revealing mysterious payments to your shell company after every distressed property sale, emails outlining your plans to force out non-HOA members, and my personal favorite, your text messages ensuring that the electrical fire would look accidental." The room erupted into gasps and whispered chatter. Karen's hands started to shake, and coffee sloshed over the rim of her mug. "This is absurd. You can't come in here with these outrageous accusations." "I'll sue you for defamation," she threatened. That was all the opening I needed. I reached into my briefcase one last time and pulled out my judicial robes. As the silk unfurled dramatically and I slipped them on, I declared, "Federal Judge Sarah Martinez, presiding over case number 2025 CR142, United States versus Thompson et al. I announced a RICO investigation into corruption, fraud, and criminal conspiracy. Karen's coffee mug clattered to the floor, its contents splashing across her designer shoes. A detail she hardly noticed. Her mouth flapped like a fish out of water. "FBI!" she sputtered. "Nobody move!" On cue, agents burst through both doors, badges gleaming. Karen's husband, the retired sergeant who had hidden countless police reports, made a break for the emergency exit, but was tackled within 3 steps. I advanced toward Karen, who had collapsed into her cherished president's chair. "You know what the biggest mistake criminals make is?" I stated coolly. "They get so wrapped up in their own power, they forget who they're really up against." I picked up her fallen gavel, the very tool she'd once used to condemn my home. Meeting adjourned. The sound of handcuffs clicking echoed through the room as FBI agents escorted Karen and her cronies away. Neighbors erupted in applause. Years of fear and intimidation finally shattered. As I packed up my evidence, Mrs. Johnson from across the street clutched me with tears in her eyes. "We should have helped you fight them," she whispered. I hugged her back as I watched Karen being led to a waiting police car. "Sometimes," I murmured quietly, "justice has to take the long route to reach the right destination." The morning of the trial felt charged. Standing before my bathroom mirror, I adjusted my judge's robe, recalling how Karen had laughed when my house burned. Now, that laughter was gone. The courtroom was packed with neighbors, reporters, and victims from other neighborhoods who'd come forward after hearing our story on the local news. Karen entered wearing an expensive suit instead of her usual yoga pants, but her face went ghostly white when she saw me seated at the bench. I'll never forget how she grabbed her lawyer's arm and whispered, "That's her, the one whose house we burned." Her lawyer's pen clattered to the floor. The evidence we laid out was staggering. Our investigation revealed 15 other houses that mysteriously caught fire after homeowners refused to join Karen's HOA. The same pattern of harassment, vandalism, and then fire. They'd then snap up the burned properties for next to nothing through a shell company owned by Karen's brother-in-law, raking in millions. We played the security footage from my cameras, and the entire courtroom gasped as they watched Karen and her cronies douse my grandmother's rose bushes with gasoline. At 2 a.m., Karen was seen shaking her head, mouthing no as her own voice echoed over the speakers. "Once it burns, you'll have to sell," she had sneered. The real shock came when Karen's husband, the retired police sergeant, finally turned on her. His loyalty had kept him silent until the overwhelming evidence broke him. He revealed everything, how they orchestrated the scheme, how they chose their targets, and how they bribed local officials to look the other way. Karen screamed, "Liar!" so loudly that the bailiff had to drag her out. One by one, people stood up to share their own tragedies. Mrs. Rodriguez, the retired teacher who lost her family photos, the Patel family whose grandfather's ashes were obliterated. Each story made Karen shrink further in her scene. Her designer suit could no longer hide the terror etched on her face. When I read the verdict, my voice was calm and unwavering. 25 years for Karen and 15 years for each board member. Their expressions finally revealed that no sum of money could shield them from justice. Karen attempted a feeble speech, claiming she was simply protecting property values, but I cut her off, just as she had dismissed my pleas about my grandmother's roses. That was 6 months ago. Today I watch as construction crews put the finishing touches on my rebuilt Victorian. The purple trim is restored exactly as Grandma painted it, and the rose garden is being revived with cuttings from the one surviving bush. Karen's old house was sold to provide victim compensation, and a kind immigrant family now calls it home. Their kids play in the yard where Karen once loomed, snapping photos of my so-called violations, while the new neighbors have formed a genuine community association, one that actually supports each other. We hold block parties in my garden, sharing food and stories. Just yesterday, Mrs. Rodriguez brought her famed empanadas and showed me family photos she'd painstakingly restored from damaged albums. Sometimes, while I'm tending my garden, neighbors stop by to thank me, not for my title, but for standing up to bullies. Local news later did a follow-up story on how our once terrorized neighborhood had transformed into a real community. They interviewed the Patels, who now host our monthly meetings in their beautiful backyard. I still keep Karen's coffee cup on my courthouse desk, the one she dropped when she finally realized who she was dealing with. It reminds me that justice may take its time, but it always prevails, just as Grandma always said. And every morning as I sip my coffee in my thriving rose garden, watching the sun rise through my perfectly purple-trimmed windows, I know that sometimes the best revenge is simply rebuilding something even more beautiful than what was lost.